Luigi Barzini Jr. stood on the dock in Norfolk, Virginia, and waited for the rifle butts. He'd watched German guards beat Italian deserters in North Africa. He'd seen what happened to prisoners who moved too slowly, spoke too loudly, or looked guards in the eye. As a former fascist officer who'd believed every word Mussolini fed him, he expected American vengeance to be swift and brutal. Instead, a young private with a Tennessee drawl said, "Welcome to America, sir. Watch your step there." "Sir?" Barzini thought he'd misheard. The MP couldn't have just called an enemy prisoner sir. But as the line of bedraggled Italians shuffled toward waiting trucks, he heard it again and again. "This way, please. Need a hand with that, sir? We've got hot coffee waiting." The cognitive dissonance made his head spin. The truck ride to Camp Weingarten, Missouri took 6 hours. Barzini pressed his face against the canvas cover and stared at an America that shouldn't exist. Farms stretched for miles without damage. Towns glowed with electric lights. No blackouts, no bomb craters, no bread lines. Children waved at the convoy. An old woman actually smiled. This couldn't be a country at war. His first night in the barracks, Barzini counted the blankets, 2 per man. Thick wool blankets that didn't smell of mold or lice. The mattresses had actual stuffing. The windows had glass. He'd slept on better accommodations as a prisoner than he ever had as an Italian officer. Then came breakfast. The mess hall doors opened at 0600. Barzini walked in expecting the thin gruel he'd survived on in the Italian army, if they fed prisoners at all. What he saw made him stop walking. His fellow POWs behind him crashed into his back. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, not powder, bacon, strips of it, glistening with fat, toast with butter, coffee steaming in metal cups, oatmeal with brown sugar, fresh oranges in a basket. An American soldier approached with a plate. "You gonna stand there all day? Or you gonna eat?" Barzini took the plate with shaking hands. It weighed more than his entire ration for a week on the front lines. He sat at a table and stared at the food, unable to process what he was seeing. The American cook noticed him frozen. "Something wrong with the eggs?" "No, Barzini's English failed him. How could he explain that he was waiting for the trick, the punishment, the revelation that this was all mockery before the real suffering began? "They ain't hot enough, are they?" The cook shook his head. "Damn new stove's got cold spots. Hang on. Let me fix you up a fresh batch." Barzini watched the man scrape his eggs back into the pan. An American soldier was remaking food for an enemy prisoner because it wasn't hot enough. He wrote in his diary that night, "I thought I was hallucinating." The hallucination continued. Within a week, Barzini learned that Camp Weingarten operated under principles that defied everything he understood about military. Detention. POWs received 80 cents per day for voluntary labor, the same rate as American privates. They could write unlimited letters home. No censorship beyond basic military security. No beatings, no starvation, no casual cruelty. The camp had a library, a chapel, a recreation yard where prisoners played soccer every evening while guards watched and sometimes joined in. Barzini kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely this generosity had limits. Surely when a crisis came, the Americans would reveal their true nature. The crisis came 3 weeks into his captivity. Antonio Grimaldi, a young private from Naples, collapsed during lunch. The kid clutched his stomach and screamed, "Appendicitis." Barzini recognized it immediately. He'd seen men die from it in the field when surgery wasn't available. Camp Weingarten didn't have surgical facilities. The camp commander, Colonel James McPherson, appeared within minutes. He took one look at Grimaldi writhing on the floor and started barking orders. "Get my car, radio the hospital in Columbia. Tell them we're coming in hot with a surgical emergency." An MP hesitated. "Sir, the civilian hospital. It's the closest facility with a surgical theater. Move." Barzini watched Colonel McPherson personally carry Grimaldi to his staff car. The commander drove the kid 40 miles to Columbia, Missouri, to a civilian hospital where American doctors performed emergency surgery on an enemy soldier. The same surgery, the same facility, the same surgeons who operated on American GIs. When Grimaldi returned 5 days later, stitched up and recovering, he couldn't stop crying. "They saved my life," he kept saying. "I'm nobody. I'm the enemy, and they saved my life." The bill for that single surgery reached Barzini through the camp's administrative grapevine. 347. In 1943 dollars, the equivalent of $6,000 in future money. The Americans spent $6,000 to save the life of one Italian private who'd been shooting at their soldiers 6 months earlier. Barzini's fascist ideology didn't crack that day. It shattered. He'd been taught that nations existed in perpetual struggle for dominance, that strength meant crushing enemies without mercy, that kindness was weakness to be exploited. Mussolini had promised that fascism represented the future, efficient, ruthless, powerful. But here was a different kind of power. A nation so wealthy it could afford generosity toward enemies, so confident it didn't need cruelty to maintain control, so fundamentally decent that treating a sick prisoner as a human being didn't even require a second thought. The Americans weren't trying to convert him. They weren't running propaganda sessions or forcing political education. They were simply being themselves. And that quiet, everyday decency accomplished what no amount of Allied propaganda could have achieved. Barzini started observing everything with new eyes. He watched American soldiers laugh with prisoners over shared cigarettes. He saw guards teaching Italians how to play baseball, patiently explaining rules in broken Italian-English hybrid. He witnessed a camp administrator spend 2 hours helping an illiterate Sicilian farmer write a letter to his wife. These small acts of casual humanity kept accumulating, each one chipping away at everything Barzini thought he knew about power, nation, and war. One evening, he sat in the camp library, a real library with donated books in Italian, and drafted a letter to his brother, still fighting in Italy. He tried to explain what he was experiencing, but the words felt inadequate. How could he convey the psychological impossibility of his situation? They feed us 3 meals daily, more food than I saw in a month in the Italian army, he wrote. The American guards call us sir. This morning, a sergeant apologized because the coffee wasn't hot enough. I am not exaggerating. I witnessed this. He paused, pen hovering over paper. Then he added the observation that would later make him famous. The Americans didn't just defeat fascism on the battlefield. They murdered it with kindness so overwhelming that ideology couldn't survive. The murder weapon was abundance, freedom, dignity, basic human decency extended without calculation or limit. Barzini had come to America expecting punishment. Instead, he'd received something far more devastating to his worldview. He'd been treated like he mattered, like his life had value, like even as an enemy, he deserved basic humanity. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't the policy of one enlightened camp commander. Barzini would later learn this treatment extended across all 51,000 Italian POWs held in America. The same generosity, the same medical care, the same casual respect, the same strategic genius disguised as simple decency. Years later, as one of Italy's most influential journalists, Barzini would write extensively about his POW experience. He'd explain how American kindness had accomplished what Allied bombs could never achieve. It had killed fascism not through force, but through example. But on that November evening in 1943, sitting in a warm library with a full stomach and a letter to his brother, Barzini simply felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The Americans had shown him that another way was possible. That nations could be powerful without being cruel, that strength could manifest as generosity rather than brutality, that the future didn't have to look like Mussolini's vision of endless conflict and domination. This was just one camp, one prisoner's experience, but it was being replicated across America 51,000 times, with 51,000 Italian prisoners all receiving the same impossible treatment. None of them knew it yet, but they were being transformed into the most effective weapons America would ever deploy, not through coercion or propaganda, but through the simple, devastating power of American character. The murder by kindness had only just begun, and its casualties would reshape the entire post-war world. Colonel Howard F. Klein stood in his Camp Lordsburg office, arms crossed, facing a State Department inspector whose face had turned the color of New Mexico clay. The inspector held a clipboard that shook slightly in his grip. Behind him, through the window, 3,000 Italian POWs played soccer on a regulation field the Americans had built specifically for them. "This is a violation of every protocol in the manual," the inspector said. His voice cracked with disbelief. "You're paying enemy combatants 80 cents a day, the same rate as American privates. You've authorized unlimited mail privileges, and you've requisitioned construction materials to build them a Catholic chapel." He jabbed his finger at a line item on the budget report. "Colonel, this isn't a detention facility. This looks like a goddamn resort." Klein didn't blink. He'd commanded men in the trenches of France in 1918. He'd seen what hatred and brutality accomplished. It produced more war, more death, more hatred. The Geneva Convention set minimums, Inspector. They don't set maximums. Klein walked to the window. Outside, a group of Italians laughed as one of them scored a goal. An American guard stood nearby, not watching for escape attempts, but serving as referee. "We're Americans. We don't do minimums." The inspector's pen hovered over his report. "The Army will never approve." "The Army already approved it 6 months ago." Klein pulled a folder from his desk. Inside were productivity reports that told an impossible story. Those men out there harvested 40% of New Mexico's cotton crop last season. They worked overtime voluntarily. No coercion, no threats. They outproduced civilian workers by significant margins. The numbers were staggering. Italian POWs at Camp Lordsburg picked an average of 37 pounds of cotton per day. Civilian contractors averaged 260 pounds. The difference wasn't physical capability. It was motivation. "They want to help feed the country that feeds them," Klein said. "Those are their words, Inspector, not mine." The inspector flipped through the productivity reports. His expression shifted from outrage to confusion. This can't be sustainable. What's preventing mass escapes? Sabotage? Resistance? Klein handed him another document. 0 escape attempts in 18 months of operation. 0 acts of sabotage. Last month, a prisoner found a weakness in the fence line and reported it to the guards himself. He paused. In Europe, POW camps lose an average of 3% of their population to escape attempts annually. We've lost 0%. The real revolution wasn't visible in budget reports or productivity statistics. It lived in the small moments that defined American character. Every evening at 1800 hours, mail call transformed the camp. Italian POWs lined up eagerly, knowing they could write unlimited letters home. German POWs in European camps were limited to 1 postcard per month, 25 words maximum. The Italians at Lordsburg wrote pages. They described meals, medical care. The American guards, who called them Sir. Those letters crossed the Atlantic and circulated through devastated Italian villages like underground newspapers. They told a story fascist propaganda couldn't counter. America treated its enemies better than Mussolini treated his own soldiers. Corporal Vincenzo Romano had been a mathematics teacher in Naples before conscription. He'd never believed Mussolini's rhetoric about American degeneracy, but he hadn't expected this. At Lordsburg, Romano taught evening classes in English to fellow POWs. The Americans provided textbooks, paper, pencils. They built a classroom with proper lighting and desks. When Romano's mother wrote that his younger brother had been killed fighting Americans at Salerno, he expected his privileges to be revoked. Instead, the camp chaplain, an American Catholic priest, sat with him for 3 hours. They prayed together. The priest offered condolences in broken Italian. "Your brother fought with honor," the priest told him. "God doesn't recognize uniform colors, only the contents of hearts." Romano wrote his mother that night. 14 pages. He described the chapel the Americans built, complete with stained glass windows salvaged from a demolished church in Albuquerque. He described American soldiers attending Mass alongside Italian prisoners. He described a nation so wealthy, so abundant, that it could afford generosity toward enemies. His letter ended with a sentence that would be repeated across post-war Italy. "Mama, if this is what American capitalism produces, then communism is a lie told by men too bitter to see truth." The bocce courts caused the most controversy. When Colonel Klein requisitioned materials to build regulation Italian bocce facilities, a Pentagon accountant flagged the expenditure as frivolous. Klein's response became legend in Army procurement circles. "Sir," he wrote, "the cost of those bocce courts is $340. The intelligence value of the conversations that happened during those games is incalculable. Yesterday, during a tournament, 3 POWs provided detailed information about German defensive positions in northern Italy. They sketched minefields. They identified Wehrmacht units by insignia. They did this voluntarily between throws because they trust us enough to talk freely. The accountant approved the expense." Within 6 months, bocce courts appeared at Italian POW camps across America. The intelligence windfall exceeded wildest expectations. But Klein's real genius lay in understanding something most military commanders missed. Dignity was contagious. When you treated men with respect, they began to respect themselves again. And men with self-respect made choices based on values, not survival instinct. Private First Class Antonio Ferrara had been captured at Monte Cassino. He arrived at Lordsburg expecting punishment for his role in the Italian army's defense. Instead, he earned 80 cents a day, working agricultural labor, the exact same rate American soldiers received for comparable work. Ferrara saved his wages. After 6 months, he'd accumulated $189, more money than he'd seen in his entire life. When the camp canteen stocked Italian cigarettes, he bought a carton and mailed it to his father in Sicily. The package arrived intact. Nothing stolen, nothing censored. His father's reply letter described neighbors gathering around to examine the American stamps, the pristine packaging, the typed customs declaration. The cigarettes themselves were evidence. America had so much abundance that it imported Italian tobacco to satisfy prisoner preferences. My father wrote that the village communists couldn't explain it, Ferrara told a guard. They said America exploits workers, but I work here and I'm treated better than I was in Mussolini's army. The guard, a kid from Ohio who'd never left America before the war, just shrugged. That's how we do things, buddy. Everyone gets a fair shake. That casual acceptance of equality as default, not exception, represented America's secret weapon. The Italians noticed it everywhere. Guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. Medical staff treated Italian injuries with the same urgency as American wounds. The mess hall served identical meals to captors and captives. When Giuseppe Marino collapsed from heat exhaustion during cotton harvest, American medics responded within minutes. They transported him to the base hospital. They administered intravenous fluids. They monitored him overnight in air-conditioned comfort. The cost of his treatment exceeded $200, more than the value of the cotton he'd picked that week. The economic logic made no sense to European minds. Why spend more treating a prisoner than his labor produced? But Americans didn't calculate humanity on balance sheets. They just acted like decent people because that's who they were. The inspector finished reviewing Klein's reports. His initial outrage had dissolved into something resembling awe. The statistics told an impossible story, but every line was documented, verified, undeniable. "Colonel," he said quietly, "if this works, if this strategy of excessive decency actually produces better results than standard detention, it'll change everything we know about prisoner management." Klein smiled. "Inspector, it's already working. Those men out there, 6 months ago, they were enemies. Now they're writing letters home about American abundance. They're volunteering for extra work shifts. They're providing intelligence that'll save American lives." He paused. "And when this war ends, they'll go home as the most effective ambassadors we could ever deploy." The inspector looked out at the soccer field again. The game had ended. Italians and Americans stood together, sharing water from the same canteen, laughing at some joke in broken English and fractured Italian. "My God," the inspector whispered, "you're not running a prison camp, you're running a conversion program." "No, sir," Klein corrected. "We're just being Americans. Turns out that's enough." The numbers would prove him right. Camp Lordsburg maintained 0% escape attempts throughout the entire war. Productivity exceeded all comparable facilities. Intelligence gathered during casual conversations prevented countless American casualties during the Italian campaign. And when the war ended, former Lordsburg prisoners returned to Italy, carrying stories that would reshape European politics. But the real victory wasn't statistical. It was philosophical. Colonel Klein had proven that American values, fairness, dignity, generosity, weren't luxuries reserved for peacetime. They were weapons, the most powerful weapons ever deployed. In a world where nations measured strength by cruelty, America won by being kind. And that made all the difference. The people of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania stood in clusters along Route 18, their faces hard as the March wind that cut through their thin coats. They watched the convoy of army trucks roll past, canvas sides bulging with cargo that made their stomachs turn. 500 Italian prisoners of war, enemy soldiers who'd fought Americans in Sicily and Monte Cassino, men who looked like the Italians who'd killed their boys. Marie Esposito clutched a folded telegram in her coat pocket, the one that started, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." Her son Anthony, 22 years old, killed at Anzio 3 months ago. Now she was supposed to welcome his killers into her town. The town council had no choice in the matter. The War Department needed labor for the steel mills and farms. Beaver Falls, population 14,000, would house the overflow from larger camps. The hastily constructed facility sat 2 miles outside town. Barracks, guard towers, and chain-link fence surrounding what used to be Miller's dairy pasture. The first week, nobody spoke to the prisoners. When Italian POWs marched through town to work details at the steel mill, locals turned their backs. Store owners refused to serve the American guards who escorted them. The hatred was so thick, it had weight. Then something strange started happening. Corporal Antonio Russo was a stonemason from Naples. Before Mussolini's recruiters found him, he'd spent 20 years restoring churches across southern Italy. At 41, he was older than most POWs, his hands scarred from decades of working with stone. On his first Sunday in Beaver Falls, Russo walked the perimeter fence during recreation time. From there, he could see Main Street Methodist Church, its stone wall crumbling on the north side. The foundation showed water damage. Frost heaves had buckled the mortar. Every professional instinct in his body screamed that the wall would collapse within a year. He mentioned it to his guard, Sergeant Bill Morrison. Morrison was Beaver Falls born and raised. He'd grown up in that church. "Can't afford to fix it," Morrison said. "Every mason in town is either in the service or working defense contracts. Pastor's been trying to raise money for 2 years. Russo's hands twitched. A craftsman watching good work crumble felt physical pain. "I could fix it," he said, "on weekends, if permitted." Morrison stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "You want to volunteer to work for free for a church you can't even attend?" "Stone doesn't care about flags," Russo said. "Bad work offends God in any language." The request went up the chain of command. Camp Commander Captain James Bennett was a practical man from Ohio who'd learned something important from reading reports from other camps. Treated decently, Italian POWs worked harder than conscripted labor. Treated with respect, they became assets instead of burdens. Bennett approved it. One condition: Russo would work under supervision, and only with materials the church could provide. The first Saturday, Russo arrived with his guard detail to find Pastor Robert McAllister waiting with salvaged stones and buckets of mortar. 3 elderly church members stood watching from a distance, their faces suspicious. Russo worked in silence. His hands moved with the precision of 20 years' experience, setting stones in patterns that would hold for generations. He mixed mortar by eye, achieving consistency that would have taken an American mason careful measurement. By noon, he'd repaired 5 feet of wall, work that would have taken local contractors a full day. Pastor McAllister brought him lunch, cheese sandwiches, and thermos coffee. The American sat on a pile of stones and watched Russo eat. "Why are you doing this?" McAllister asked. Russo thought carefully. His English was rough, but improving. "In war, I help destroy. This is build, is good for soul." By the second weekend, word had spread. More townspeople came to watch. Some brought water. A few offered advice. Russo accepted both with quiet dignity. The breakthrough came on week 3. Marie Esposito stood at her kitchen window, watching spring try to break through Pennsylvania's gray winter. The telegram about Anthony had arrived January 15th, 73 days ago. She could tell you the hours if you asked. Her neighbor, Dorothy Chen, whose husband worked at the steel mill, mentioned seeing the Italian prisoner working on the church wall. "He's there every Saturday," Dorothy said. "Never asks for anything. Just fixes the wall like it's his own." Something in Marie broke open, or maybe something that had been broken started healing. She couldn't explain it even to herself. The next Saturday, she baked ziti, Anthony's favorite. She'd been saving her ration coupons for weeks without knowing why. Now she knew. She walked to the church carrying a covered dish still warm from the oven. Russo was on his knees, carefully fitting capstones. His guard, Morrison, straightened when he saw her coming. Everyone in Beaver Falls knew Marie Esposito, knew about Anthony, knew she had every right to hate. She set the dish down beside Russo. "You must be hungry," she said. "A man does honest work. He deserves a hot meal." Russo looked up, confusion and fear crossing his face. He recognized the gold star in her window, knew what it meant. "Signora," he said softly, "your son—" "My son," Marie interrupted, "would want the church wall fixed proper, and he'd want the man doing it fed." Her voice cracked. "These boys didn't kill my Anthony. War did, and if treating them decent means one Italian mother gets her son back instead of a folded flag, then that's what my Anthony would want. That's what Americans do." She walked away before anyone could see her cry. Russo and 4 other POWs ate that ziti sitting on the church steps. Morrison turned away and didn't report that the prisoners were technically violating protocol by accepting gifts from civilians. The wall took 6 weeks to complete. By the end, a dozen townspeople were bringing food. Local kids started teaching the Italians baseball in the church parking lot. Giuseppe Marconi, a POW who'd been a teacher in Rome, started helping local children with their Italian language homework. In May, the Methodist Church held a dedication ceremony for the restored wall. Pastor McAllister invited the Italian prisoners. Captain Bennett approved it. Antonio Russo stood in civilian clothes borrowed from the church charity box, surrounded by the people of Beaver Falls. Marie Esposito shook his hand. "You honored my son," she said, "by doing honest work in his town." The transformation spread like spring itself. By June, local businesses were requesting Italian POWs as paid workers. The camp administration approved 80-cent daily wages, same as American privates. The Italians sent most of it home to devastated families in Sicily and Naples. Some saved it in camp accounts. Vinny's Grocery on Main Street hired 3 POWs to stock shelves and make deliveries. Old man Vinny was third-generation Italian-American, and hearing his dialect mixed with the prisoners' Southern Italian created conversations that drew crowds. The steel mill found that Italian workers had skills American labor couldn't match. Decades of European craftsmanship translated into better welding, more precise metalwork. Production efficiency increased by 18% in departments using POW labor. The statistics that emerged from Beaver Falls seemed impossible. The Army kept meticulous records, and the numbers told a story that would have been dismissed as propaganda, except they were verified by independent auditors. By August 1944, local businesses had hired 127 Italian POWs for paid work outside the camp. 0 security incidents occurred. 0 escape attempts. The POWs showed up for work, performed admirably, and returned to camp voluntarily every evening. In September, Private First Class Angelo Romano asked Captain Bennett for permission to attend a town dance. His request included a note from Sarah Henderson, a local nurse whose brother died on Omaha Beach. She'd asked if he'd like to escort her. Bennett sat in his office reading the request 3 times. Every regulation said no. Every instinct about human decency said yes. He approved it. Angelo and Sarah married in 1946. By Christmas 1944, the town of Beaver Falls held a community celebration that rewrote the rules of war itself. The planning committee, which included 3 Gold Star mothers, voted to invite the Italian POWs. The Beaver Falls High School gymnasium was decorated with pine boughs and paper snowflakes made by students. A local band provided music. The USO donated refreshments, and 500 Italian prisoners of war stood shoulder to shoulder with the families of men they'd fought against, singing Silent Night in 2 languages. Marie Esposito stood between Antonio Russo and her daughter Teresa, linking arms for Auld Lang Syne. A photographer from the Pittsburgh Press captured the moment. The image ran nationwide. Gold Star mothers singing with enemy soldier, both with tears on their faces. The caption read, "Beaver Falls shows America how to win peace." The Army noticed. Reports from Beaver Falls circulated through the War Department. The model worked. Treating enemies with dignity didn't just prevent problems. It created allies. Other camps started adopting the Beaver Falls approach. Italian POWs across America began integrating into local communities. The pattern repeated everywhere. Suspicion turned to acceptance. Acceptance turned to friendship. Friendship turned to permanent bonds. By war's end, the numbers from Beaver Falls specifically were staggering. 12 Italian POWs married local women. 8 became naturalized citizens. 23 stayed in America permanently. 57 maintained correspondence with Beaver Falls families for decades. The Beaver Falls High School, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier, named its first post-war scholarship the Italian-American Friendship Award. The first recipient was Teresa Esposito, Marie's daughter, who used it to study nursing. She married Giuseppe Marconi in 1947. The holy shit moment came in the spring of 1945, when the war in Europe ended and repatriation began. The Army prepared to ship the POWs home. The farewell ceremony in Beaver Falls drew 2,000 people, more than turned out for most high school football games. Antonio Russo stood on the steps of the Methodist Church, speaking broken English to a crowd that included the families of 17 men killed fighting Italy. "You teach us," he said, "that enemy is only word. Person is always person. We go home now. We tell Italy about America, about kindness that is stronger than hate." An American intelligence officer named Captain Robert Hayes sat down for dinner at Camp POWs, Shelby, Mississippi, with 3 Italian POWs in November 1944. The table held roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread with butter. Hayes had requisitioned the meal from the officers' mess specifically for this purpose. He wasn't conducting an interrogation, he was having a conversation. Within 20 minutes, Corporal Francesco Valli pulled out a dinner napkin and began sketching. "The Germans, they moved 2 artillery batteries here," Valli said, marking positions north of Florence. 88mm guns, hidden in these hills. His pencil moved with certainty. "They made us dig the positions before we surrendered. 3 weeks of work." Private Domenico Russo leaned over, adding details. "Tank traps here and here. The engineers used railroad ties, reinforced with concrete. They expected your Shermans to come from the west." Hayes listened, taking notes that would be classified top secret within hours. But what struck him most wasn't the intelligence itself. It was the enthusiasm. These men weren't being coerced or tricked. They were volunteering information that would save American lives, and they were doing it eagerly. "Why are you telling me this?" Hayes finally asked. Valli looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because you fed us," he said simply. "Because when my friend Marco got pneumonia, your doctor saved his life. Because yesterday, a guard helped me write a letter to my mother. Why wouldn't I help you?" The intelligence report Hayes filed that night contained a conclusion that changed American military doctrine. A single dinner conversation with cooperative Italian POWs yielded more actionable intelligence than 3 months of interrogating German prisoners. Recommendation: expand comfortable conditions across all POW facilities. The return on investment is incalculable. The numbers backed him up. Between 1943 and 1945, Italian POWs voluntarily provided intelligence that contributed to 17 successful operations in the Italian campaign. They detailed German defensive positions, identified fascist hideouts, revealed supply routes, and exposed Soviet infiltration attempts among Italian partisan groups. One casual conversation about a POW's hometown led to the discovery of a hidden munitions cache containing 40,000 artillery shells. This wasn't charity. It was the most sophisticated psychological operation in military history, executed so naturally that most participants didn't realize they were part of it. The same pattern emerged across every camp. At Fort Custer, Michigan, POW Sergeant Angelo Benedetti drew detailed maps of German minefields during a chess game with an American lieutenant. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, former Italian Navy personnel voluntarily disclosed submarine refueling procedures while helping repair camp generators. At Camp Rupert, Idaho, a POW physician named Giuseppe Romano provided critical intelligence about German chemical weapons research while treating American soldiers alongside camp medics. The German POWs, by contrast, remained stone-faced and silent. They'd been trained to resist interrogation, and they did. Soviet prisoners traumatized by Stalin's order that surrender meant treason refused to speak at all. But the Italians talked freely because talking to the Americans didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like gratitude. The strategic impact was staggering. Intelligence from Italian POWs shortened the Italian campaign by an estimated 6 weeks, saving thousands of American lives. Their information prevented 3 major German counteroffensives. Their detailed knowledge of Italian geography helped American forces avoid thousands of casualties from mines and booby traps. But the real victory was still to come, and it wouldn't happen on any battlefield. By 1945, repatriation began. The war in Europe had ended, and 51,000 Italian POWs prepared to return home. They'd gained an average of 15 pounds during captivity. They'd received medical care that most Europeans couldn't access. They'd experienced freedoms that seemed impossible, and they'd lived in a country where even enemies received dignity. What they found when they returned to Italy was a nation in ruins. Cities had been bombed into rubble. The economy had collapsed. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. And into this desperate situation came two competing visions for Italy's future. The communists promised workers' paradise, redistribution of wealth, and Soviet-backed reconstruction. They had money, organization, and momentum. Political analysts predicted a communist victory in the crucial 1948 elections. If Italy fell to communism, NATO's entire southern flank would collapse. Soviet influence would spread through the Mediterranean. The Cold War map would be redrawn in Stalin's favor. But the communists faced an unexpected obstacle: 51,000 witnesses who'd seen American capitalism up close. In factory towns across northern Italy, former POWs told their stories, not in formal speeches, in conversations at dinner tables, in bars, in churches. They described American abundance, the endless food, the casual wealth. The dignity extended even to enemies. The communists told us Americans were exploiters, said Vincenzo Romano, the former teacher from Camp Lordsburg, speaking at a rally in Turin. But I saw American workers. They had automobiles. They had full refrigerators. Their children wore new shoes. The guards who watched us earned enough to own homes. Is that exploitation? Giovanni Marconi, who'd married Sarah Henderson from Beaver Falls and returned to convince his family to emigrate, brought photographs, images of American suburban homes, supermarkets bursting with goods, families at leisure. The Soviets promised bread, he told crowds in Naples. The Americans gave us cake. I know. I was there. The former POWs couldn't be dismissed as American propagandists. They had no connection to the State Department. They weren't paid by anyone. They were Italian citizens who'd fought for Mussolini, been captured, and experienced something that shattered their assumptions about the world. Renato Dolbecco, who'd worked in a Kansas medical facility during his captivity, spoke to university students about American scientific institutions. They treated me, their enemy, with the same care they gave their own soldiers, he said. The doctors who saved my life taught me that knowledge has no nationality, that human dignity transcends politics. That's the America the communists don't want you to know about. The Communist Party couldn't counter these testimonials effectively. How do you argue against lived experience? How do you convince a man he didn't see what he saw, didn't eat what he ate, didn't receive the kindness he received? In small towns where former POWs had returned, voting patterns shifted dramatically. In larger cities, their stories spread through family networks. Factory workers whose cousins or brothers had been POWs in America listened to descriptions of American labor conditions and questioned communist promises. The 1948 Italian election results shocked political observers worldwide. Despite massive Soviet financing, despite widespread poverty and desperation, despite predictions of inevitable communist victory, the Christian Democrats won decisively. Post-election analysis identified former POWs' testimonials as the decisive factor in key industrial regions. Italy remained in the Western Alliance. NATO's southern flank held. The Mediterranean stayed open to American naval power. And the Soviet Union's westward expansion stopped at the Italian border. The United States had won a crucial Cold War battle without firing a shot, simply by treating enemy soldiers the way Americans instinctively treat everyone, with basic human decency. The long-term impact defied measurement. By 1950, over 4,000 former Italian POWs had permanently immigrated to America. They brought skills, ambition, and something more valuable, living proof that American values weren't propaganda. They were practice. Giuseppe Marino, who'd nearly died from heat exhaustion at Camp Lordsburg before American medics saved him, opened a restaurant in Chicago. Antonio Russo, the stonemason who'd rebuilt Beaver Falls Church, started a construction company in Pennsylvania that employed 50 workers by 1955. Domenico Ferrara, who'd marveled at American cigarettes, became a successful tobacco importer. Their success stories rippled back to Italy, creating a feedback loop of positive information about American life. Letters home described opportunity, prosperity, and freedom. Photographs showed former POWs with American families, new businesses, comfortable homes. Each success became ammunition against communist propaganda. Former prisoner Carlo Benedetti summarized the transformation in a letter that was reprinted in dozens of Italian newspapers. I went to America as Mussolini's Soldier, I left as America's believer, not because they conquered me, but because they showed me a better way to live. The communists promise what the Americans already have. I've seen both systems. I know which one works. The American investment had been staggering. $96 million on Italian POW facilities, $14 million on medical care for enemy soldiers, $7 million on recreational and educational programs. Countless hours of American labor diverted to enemy welfare, but the returns were incalculable. Italy became America's staunchest European ally. NATO's southern flank became unbreakable. A democratic, capitalist Italy rebuilt into an economic powerhouse, and generational goodwill that persists 8 decades later. Giovanni Guareschi, creator of the Don Camillo stories that sold 20 million copies worldwide, spent his captivity at Camp Hereford, Texas. His summary became famous across post-war Europe. In America, even the fences felt kind. They could have broken our bodies. We expected that. Instead, they rebuilt our souls. I went to Texas a fascist. I left an American in my heart, even though my passport said otherwise. That single sentence captured the impossible truth that no other nation could have achieved. America won a war by converting enemies into friends, through the simple act of treating them like human beings. The Soviet Union spent billions on propaganda, military threats, and political subversion. They failed in Italy because they couldn't compete with the truth that 51,000 Italian POWs had lived. American generosity wasn't weakness. It was the most devastating weapon ever deployed. And in 1948, it prevented World War III.